In the summer of 64 AD, the greatest city in the world caught fire. It burned for 6 days, and then it burned for 3 more. By the time the smoke cleared, 10 of Rome's 14 districts were gone. 1 million people had nowhere to sleep. Thousands were dead. The air above the city was black for a week. Travelers on the roads outside Rome could see the glow from miles away, a smear of orange light against the night sky, like a second sunset that never went down. And the emperor? He was 30 miles away, playing music. To understand what happened that summer, you need to understand what Rome was. Not the Rome of marble columns and triumphant arches that we imagine today. That Rome, the clean white Rome of paintings and textbooks, never really existed. The real Rome was something else entirely. Something louder, something darker, something that smelled like fire and rotting fish and a million bodies living too close together in a city that had never been designed for any of them. 1 million people. That was the population of Rome in the 1st century. 1 million people crammed into an area smaller than many modern cities. The wealthy lived in sprawling villas on the hills, the Palatine, the Aventine, the Esquiline, with gardens and fountains and rooms that caught the breeze. But most Romans did not live on the hills. Most Romans lived in the valleys between them, in buildings called insulae apartment blocks, 5, 6, 7 stories tall, built of wood and cheap brick, and the kind of confidence that only comes from never having seen a building collapse on its own residents. The streets between them were narrow. Not narrow by modern standards, narrow by any standard. In some parts of the city, 2 people could not walk side by side. Carts were banned from the streets during daylight hours because there was simply no room for them alongside the foot traffic. At night, when the carts came back, the noise was so constant and so violent that the poet Juvenal complained he couldn't sleep. The city never stopped. The city never quieted. The city was a living thing that breathed and sweated, and occasionally caught fire and burned a neighborhood to the ground. Fire was not unusual in Rome. That is the first thing to understand. It was expected. Every summer, when the heat came and the wood dried and the cooking flames multiplied across 1 million cramped kitchens, something burned. A tenement here, a warehouse there. The fire brigades, the vigiles, 7,000 men spread across the city in 14 cohorts, knew the summer months. They knew what summer meant, but they had never seen anything like this. The night of July 18th was a Saturday. The city was restless. It usually was on summer nights. Too hot to sleep, too crowded to find peace anywhere. The Circus Maximus sat at the heart of the city, the great long oval of the chariot track, the biggest entertainment venue the ancient world had ever built. On a race day, 200,000 Romans packed into its stands. But that night, it was empty. The shops built into its outer walls, the food stalls and oil merchants and small traders who lived and worked in the shadow of the great stadium were closed. The lamps were out, and then something ignited. No one recorded the moment. No one was watching. Whatever started it, a lamp left burning, a spark from a kitchen, an accident, or something else entirely. Within minutes, the flames were moving. The summer wind, dry and constant, the same wind that had been pressing against the city for weeks, pushing the heat down into the narrow streets, took the fire and carried it north, into the Palatine, into the Forum, into the neighborhoods that had stood for centuries, that had survived wars and floods and the occasional riot, that had never imagined they could simply cease to exist in a single night. People woke up to screaming. That is how it always starts. Not the smell of smoke, the smell came later. First the screaming, other people's panic bleeding through the walls of the building you were sleeping in, the sound that tells your body something is wrong before your mind has caught up. Then the heat. Then the glow through the shutters. Then the moment when you understood. They grabbed what they could, a child, a coin purse, the deed to a property that would not exist by morning. A family idol, small and bronze, and carried through 3 generations, and they ran. Into streets that were already packed with other people running, streets so narrow that the crowd became its own obstacle, that the panic of escape became indistinguishable from the panic of being trapped. The fire moved faster than they did. It jumped across alleyways. It climbed the sides of buildings. It found pockets of stored oil and erupted upward in columns of flame that lit the whole sky. The vigils fought it. They tore down buildings in the fire's path to create gaps it could not cross, a brutal, necessary tactic, destroying homes to save neighborhoods. Sometimes it worked. That night, it did not work. The wind was too strong. The buildings were too dry. The fire was too fast. By dawn, whole districts were gone. Not damaged, not partially burned. Gone. The stones of the road showing through the ash. The outlines of walls that no longer had anything above them. The occasional chimney standing alone in a field of rubble like a finger pointing at the sky. And the people who had lived there packed into the open spaces of the city, into the temples that had survived, into the gardens of the wealthy who had opened their gates, or simply sleeping in the fields outside the city walls, under the stars, with nothing. Nero was in Antium when it started. Antium was his birthplace, the coastal town 30 miles south of Rome, where he had built a private villa that he loved more than the city. He was young, 26 years old, in the 10th year of his reign, and he was not in Rome. When the reports reached him, riders coming hard down the Via Appia, covered in dust and the smell of smoke, he came back. That part is not disputed. He returned to the burning city and he did what an emperor was supposed to do. He organized relief. He threw open the Campus Martius, the great open field north of the city, to the displaced. He opened his own gardens. He brought in food from Ostia and from the neighboring towns, and he ordered the price of grain lowered so that those who had lost everything could still eat. The ancient sources record this. Even the ones who hated him record this. And then the fire stopped briefly, and then, driven by a new shift in the wind, it started again. This time in a different district. This time in a direction that pointed suspicion toward the people who were supposed to be fighting it. Some witnesses later claimed to have seen men not fire victims, not residents, not panicked civilians, men with torches, moving deliberately. Men who, when challenged, said they were acting on orders. Whose orders? They did not say. The second wave burned for 3 more days. When it was finally over, the accounting was staggering. 3 of Rome's 14 districts had been completely destroyed. 7 more were heavily damaged. Only 4 had come through intact. The temple of Jupiter Stator was gone. The temple of Vesta, the sacred heart of the city, the flame that had burned since the founding of Rome, had been extinguished for the first time in living memory. The archives, the artwork, the irreplaceable things that a civilization accumulates over 7 centuries and cannot replace, burned. And within months, Nero announced his plans for reconstruction. It would be, he said, a new Rome. A better Rome. Wider streets. He mandated minimum widths that would have been impossible in the old city. Fire breaks between buildings, height limits on the insulae, stone and brick construction instead of wood. It was, by any measure, a sensible and far-sighted urban planning initiative. The kind of thing that a responsible emperor, confronted with a disaster, would undertake. The people of Rome noticed something else. In the middle of the new city, in the space where 300,000 Romans had lived before the fire cleared the land, Nero was building a palace. Not a palace in the way that word is usually used. Not a large house, or a complex of official buildings, or even the kind of sprawling residence that other emperors had built on the Palatine Hill. Something different. Something that had no precedent in Roman history. Something that, when people finally understood the scale of what was being built, made them stop and reconsider everything they thought they knew about the man who ruled them. He called it the Domus Aurea, the Golden House. It covered 130 acres of the center of Rome. To put that in perspective, the entire city of ancient Athens would have fit inside it. It had its own lake, not a decorative pool, not a reflecting pond, but a lake large enough for boats, surrounded by buildings designed to look like a small city. A stage set of civilization built for the amusement of one man. It had forests, it had vineyards, it had farmland, inside the city. For no practical reason except that Nero wanted to look out of his window and see fields. The rooms were decorated with frescoes so detailed and so innovative that artists would still be studying them 1,500 years later. The dining rooms had rotating ceilings that opened to shower guests with flowers and perfume. The walls were inlaid with mother-of-pearl and semi-precious stones. The floors were heated. The baths were supplied with both salt water and sulfur water, piped in for medicinal purposes. And at the entrance, at the point where the Golden House met the city, where a visitor first understood what they were approaching, stood a statue.
And at the entrance, at the point where the Golden House met the city, where a visitor first understood what they were approaching, stood a statue. Bronze, 130 feet tall. The height of a 12-story building. A figure modeled on the sun god Helios, but with the face of Nero. The largest freestanding bronze statue the Western world had ever seen. It caught the light in the morning and threw a shadow across the city at dusk, a shadow shaped like an emperor. When it was finished, Nero walked through his new palace and said, according to the sources, and the sources may have been editorializing, he said, "Good. Now I can finally live like a human being." Rome heard that and did not forget it. The rumor had been circulating since the ashes were still warm. Nero had started the fire. It was too convenient. The land cleared, the palace built, the old city swept away to make room for a new one with an emperor-sized hole in its center. The rumor had no proof. It may have had no truth, but it had logic, and in the absence of answers, logic is what people reach for. Nero needed to redirect the anger. He chose the Christians. They were, at this point in Roman history, a small and poorly understood sect. They had been in Rome for perhaps 30 years, a community that had grown around the teachings of a Jewish preacher executed in Judea during the reign of Tiberius. They kept to themselves. They refused to participate in the public religious rituals that held Roman society together: the sacrifices, the festivals, the worship of the imperial cult. They spoke, in whispers, about the end of the world, about fire coming to judge the wicked. To Roman ears, that last part sounded suspicious. Nero arrested them. The Christian sources and the Roman sources agree on what followed, even if they disagree on the details. Christians were brought before courts and tortured until they named others. The named ones were brought in and tortured until they named more. The accusations spread through the community like the word is unavoidable, like fire. The executions were public. They were spectacular. They were designed to be watched, because Nero understood that the people of Rome needed to see something. They needed to see guilt punished. They needed to see an explanation embodied in suffering flesh, needed to believe that the fire had a cause and the cause was being dealt with. Christians were sewn into animal skins and thrown to dogs in the arena. They were crucified along the roads leading into the city, turned into landmarks, warnings, signposts of imperial displeasure. They were covered in pitch and set alight at night, human torches illuminating Nero's garden parties, the emperor watching from above, while below him, people burned for the second time that summer. Tacitus, and this is important, because Tacitus was not a Christian and had no particular sympathy for Christians, Tacitus wrote that even Romans who despised the sect felt pity watching this. Even people who believed the Christians were guilty of something felt that what was being done to them exceeded any crime they might have committed. It was not justice. It was performance. Among those who died in those months was a man named Peter. He had been a fisherman in Galilee before he became a follower of the preacher from Nazareth. He had come to Rome, the center of the world, because if the message was going to reach the world, Rome was where it had to begin. He had been in the city for years, building the community that Nero would now destroy. When they came for him, he asked for one alteration to his execution. He said he was not worthy to die the same way his teacher had died. He asked to be crucified upside down. They granted the request. On a hill just outside the city walls, a low, unremarkable hill used for executions, the kind of place a city accumulates at its edges when it needs somewhere to put its condemned. That hill is now called Vatican Hill. The church built above Peter's grave is called St. Peter's Basilica. The city that grew up around that church is called Vatican City. All of it, every stone of it, every pilgrim who has ever walked through its gates traces back to that hill, that execution, that summer. The summer Nero may or may not have burned Rome. The question of whether he actually did it has occupied historians for 2,000 years and will probably occupy them for 2,000 more. The evidence is genuinely ambiguous. Tacitus, the most rigorous ancient historian, says the fire started in the shops near the Circus Maximus and spread by accident, but he does not rule out human intervention, and he notes the suspicious witnesses who claim to have seen men with torches. Suetonius, writing 50 years after Tacitus and with less commitment to precision, says Nero did it openly and sent agents to start fires in multiple locations. Cassius Dio, writing a century after that, agrees with Suetonius. But here is the problem with all three of them. They all wrote after Nero was dead. They all wrote after the Flavian dynasty. The family that came to power after Nero had spent years rewriting the narrative of his reign, emphasizing every cruelty and every excess, building a monster out of a complicated man because monsters are politically useful. The Colosseum was built where Nero's lake had been. The colossal statue of Nero was rededicated, renamed, given a new face, turned into a monument to the sun, rather than an emperor. Nero's golden house was buried under the public baths of his successors. History is not a record. History is an argument, and the people who make the argument are always the people who survived. Nero did not survive. In 68 AD, 4 years after the fire, the General Galba rebelled in Spain. Then the General Otho. Then the General Vitellius. The legions that had fought Nero's wars began to ask each other why they were still fighting for him. The Praetorian Guard, the elite soldiers whose entire purpose was to protect the emperor, quietly reached the conclusion that their futures were elsewhere. The Senate declared Nero an enemy of the state. That meant he could be killed on sight by anyone without legal consequence. It meant his property was forfeit. It meant his name would be struck from public monuments. It meant everything he had built would be reassigned, renamed, repurposed. He fled Rome in the night. 4 servants went with him. They rode east from the city in the dark, without torches, without the imperial guard, without the trappings of power that had surrounded him since he was 17 years old. He hid in a villa owned by a freedman named Phaon, 4 miles outside the city. A shallow hole had been dug in the garden, a hiding place, or perhaps something worse. He lay in the garden of that villa and listened. In the distance, he could hear the hooves of horses on the stone road. The soldiers sent to bring him back, getting louder, getting closer. He had a blade. He knew what it was for. He knew what was expected. But he hesitated. The sources all agree on this. He hesitated for a long time. He said things, fragments recorded by the servant who was present, fragments that may have been polished by the writer, who later set them down, but fragments nonetheless. He said, "How ugly and vulgar my life has become." He pressed the blade to his throat and then did not press further. The hooves were very close now. A servant named Epaphroditus helped him. His last words, according to Suetonius, were, "Qualis artifex pereo?" What an artist dies in me. He was 30 years old. Rome was rebuilt. It took years, but it was built back better than before, in some ways. The new building codes that Nero had mandated, the ones that people had mocked as an attempt to cover up his guilt, turned out to be genuinely sensible urban policy. Wider streets, fire breaks, stone construction. The Rome that emerged from the ashes of 64 AD was more durable, more ordered, more survivable than the Rome that had burned. The Golden House did not last. Nero's successors stripped it efficiently: the marble, the bronze fittings, the decorated panels, anything valuable and portable. Vespasian drained the lake and began building the Colosseum on its bed, a gift to the Roman people, a deliberate act of symbolic reclamation. The palace itself was buried, literally buried, filled with rubble and built over, the foundations used as the substructure for new baths and new temples. Centuries passed. The Golden House became a rumor, then a legend, then a story that people weren't sure had ever been true. The hill above it grew gardens. Children played on it. The city expanded over it and forgot what was underneath. Then, sometime in the 1480s, a young Roman walking on the Esquiline Hill fell through the ground. He dropped into a cavern, a vast, decorated cavern, its ceiling covered in frescoes. Strange images, delicate figures, intricate designs of animals and flowers and mythological scenes, painted in colors that had not faded in 1400 years because they had been sealed in darkness, preserved by the very act of being buried. He had found the Golden House. Word spread. Artists came. They lowered themselves on ropes through the hole, hanging in the dark with torches, pressing their faces close to walls that had last been seen by the servants of a dead emperor. They copied the paintings. They sketched them. They carried the designs back to the surface and back to their studios and back into the living art of the Renaissance. You can see those designs today in the Vatican, in the loggia that Raphael painted for Pope Leo X, in the decorative work of buildings across Italy and France and Spain. The style even has a name, grotesque, from the Italian grotta, meaning cave, meaning the cave where those paintings were found, Nero's cave.